So welcome everyone. I'm very glad you're here. My name's James Love. I am the Chief Product Officer at Aptem, and this is session 2 in our AI and change series. If you came to session 1, thank you so much for coming back. If this is your first one, welcome. You don't necessarily need to have seen session 1 to follow today, but it was recorded as well. So if you wish to go back and rewatch it, please do feel free. And there were some handouts that we provided as well, so I'm sure we can get those to you if needed. So first of all, I guess there's 3 things people say about AI, and I want to start with what I've heard a lot in the last month, and you've probably heard in and around your business as well, coming from people in the sector and people just like yourselves. AI is going to replace my job. AI is a paper tiger. It's been overhyped. AI is too risky for regulated work. We can't touch it. All 3 of those are actually partly right. And that's not said to scare you, because all 3 of them are mostly unhelpful. By the end of today, I want to give you something better than some sort of headline or some sort of sensationalist argument. I want to give you a clear picture of what this is and how it works in practice, and ultimately what you can actually do with it in the next week that entirely mitigates a lot of those statements. This is very powerful. You are probably experiencing it already. And it's not that it's coming to replace jobs, it's coming probably to redefine a lot of jobs. And being ready for it, being able to take that change is the thing that's going to be ultimately helping you preserve your operations moving forwards and keep you growing and keep you learning. One, I guess, quick promise today, I'm going to be using a lot of words and terminology. Part of today's session is to help you understand that terminology. But if at any point you don't really understand something I've raised, drop it in to the Q&A and I'll cover it again at the end. The idea here today is not to use jargon for the sake of it, but I am going to use some because this is being used a lot in practice. If something sounds unfamiliar, you're really not behind. The language is just new and it's still percolating through. So what are we going to cover for the next 45 minutes or so? Ultimately, I'm going to share with you 3 keywords at the start, so we all share that vocabulary from the beginning. I'm going to be explaining additional bits of vocabulary as we go through today's session and giving them some real context for you to understand. I'm going to talk about 3 tools kind of side by side: ChatGPT, Claude, Microsoft Copilot. The 3 names you're going to hear a lot and probably a number of you in the room are already using. I'm going to talk about 4 risks. I'm going to name them, size them. They're not meant to be scary, but they're just to be real and manageable. I'm sorry for this, going to give you one little bit of a homework task that you can start on Monday. The idea is that you would complete this task before you attend the next webinar in this series. I'm not doing any demos today. I am talking and I'm going to be taking you through some slides and I will take questions at the end. So what are those 3 words? Number 1, technically you could argue that some of these are not words, but generative AI is a term that is used a lot. This is AI that produces new context. It could produce text, images, code, potentially even video. That's the branch we're in today. The key line here to take away is that AI might here have written a birthday card rhyme for your colleague in the last month. It's the same family of AI that can also summarize a Skills England standard this afternoon. It's the same engine, but different tasks. Number 2, large language models, often just called LLMs as a shortening. This is the engine inside the chat tools. The generative AI we talked about is backed by LLMs. It's been trained on an absolutely enormous amount of text, and it's very good at predicting what words might come next. If that sounds both underwhelming and a lot at the same time, it's good that you feel that way. It really should, because whilst this appears like magic, it really isn't. It's pattern matching. It's working at scale. It's acting fast enough to feel like a conversation, but ultimately it's not really a conversation. One thing you need to hold on to and keep in mind when using any of these tools is that confident does not mean correct. LLM can appear very confident in its output. It was built that way. It's trained that way. The model can always sound sure of itself and still be wrong. We'll come back to that when we talk about risk. Finally, prompt. A prompt is what you type in. It doesn't really mean much more than that, but there is an overall sort of request that sits behind it, or the instruction. If you think about it like giving work to a very capable, but also very literal, brand new colleague who's read a lot about you, but doesn't really know you, your team, or what you mean, that's pretty much what you're doing when you're providing a prompt to AI. If you give vague instructions, you get vague work. If you give them a clear task, you might get something you can use. This is ultimately the thing that you can control most. You can't control generative AI and what it does. You can't control the LLMs that sit behind the scenes, but you can absolutely control what you do with the prompt. So we're going to spend a few minutes now talking about what a good prompt actually looks like. I apologize to anybody in the room who is already a bit more advanced, but there's still some good principles here to understand. I've read a lot of advice on this. It is a large part of my job anyway, and I'll be honest, I use AI a great deal in my day-to-day work. Most of that advice overcomplicates things or will contradict, and it can skip the bits that really matter. So the introductory version for people who are just getting into it, but still really good practice for what you would think about longer term. It's something I teach my team. It sits in 5 parts. This really puts it in the order your brain naturally builds them anyway, but it also puts them in an order and a level of understanding of a hierarchy that this agent can understand, or this solution can understand. One thing to remember is because generative AI was trained and built using LLMs, which in and of themselves were trained using a huge corpus of human created content, it kind of thinks like us. So the very first thing to do is to build some context. You want to be adding in who you are, who it's for, why the thing it is you're doing or asking it to do matters. The AI is going to guess really badly without it. You can also think about including in this step a little bit about how you want it to behave. Remember, it's that very literal new employee. They probably knew the kind of job they were coming in to do, but it doesn't hurt to give them a bit of extra confirmation of the specific thing you want them to do. Then you move on to the task. What's the one thing you want it to do? One verb, one deliverable. You don't need to overcomplicate this. A lot of these models are very capable at handling complex tasks, so if you want to extend further, you can, but start simple. Materials are critically important as a third step. What you're giving it is ultimately going to help scope and improve the answer that's provided. If you're talking about a document, paste it in. Don't give it a general idea of what's in that document. Attach the file. Describing that file is no good to it. All of these solutions now are very capable at reading through large bodies of content. Next, you need to define the shape of what it is that you want back. That's things like the format, the length, the tone, the structure. And that could be relating back to, and we'll get to that in our example in a minute, a template. What's critical to add in here is also anything you don't want, constraints, ways you don't want it to operate. Give it that instruction. Don't assume that it will know because you haven't told it to not do something, that it will know not to do something. The final thing I always recommend you add is some sort of check. 3 questions that you're going to bake in before you press send. You're thinking about these things. Who's going to see this? What decision does it drive? And what's the worst case if it's wrong? Think through those things. And as you'll see in a bit of an example in a minute, you can always ask it to ask you clarifying questions if you're unsure. Context, task, materials, shape, and check. Say it once and it'll stick. I apologize, that's not some sort of witty acronym. I probably could have turned it into one, but it's a very simple understanding of the general shape that you want a prompt to have. A really quick note on why that ordering matters. Context is always going first because everything else sits on top of it. These solutions work quite hierarchically. They understand what you provide them in easy steps. And that also includes formatting of the way that you put the prompt in. Putting it in as one long line or one paragraph might work, but actually structure it a bit. Put some line breaks in, put some headings in. Those titles I talked about, context, task, materials, shape, check, put them in as titles. Let's move on to a worked example. So here's a real prompt built within that pattern. Picture this. You're a curriculum manager at a training provider. There may even be some of you on the call. Your teams are delivering the level 3 data technician apprenticeship. 14 new apprentices are going to start in 3 weeks, and you need a staff briefing that your assessor team can read in 10 minutes. Here's what you write. Context. I'm a curriculum manager at an ITP. I'm preparing induction for 14 new apprentices on the level 3 data technician standard. That's fantastic. You've given it that context and that understanding. Next line, task. Summarize the standard into a 2-page staff briefing the assessor team can read in 10 minutes. It's a really clear identification of what task you want it to output. It's also starting to touch a little bit on the shape. Materials. In this case, you're going to tell it that you are attaching the full Skills England standard and attaching the internal briefing template that you already have so that it stays in your format. Shape. Match our template attached. 1 KSB summary plus a second page of tutor notes and risk flags. Use bullets. UK English. Do not infer content from other standards. It can be important to do that because if you've described that you want it to look at standards, well, maybe it's going to go off and try and be very helpful. Remember or think about these tools as almost like a Labrador puppy really wanting to please you. It's going to try and do more unless you tell it not to. Finally, you're going to tell it, before answering, ask me clarifying questions one at a time. If anything is missing from the standard or the template. That's really simply 5 lines of ordinary English. I do want to loop back to one at a time. That's one of those tricks that you can use when you are creating prompts. If you don't ask it to do something one at a time, what you might get back is 10 questions in a row, and then that feels a little overwhelming sometimes to respond to. But it also does another intriguing thing, because as you answer question 1, it may realize it didn't need to ask question 2, and you actually therefore save a bit of time and energy. That's ultimately what a good prompt looked like. You enter that in, press enter, and 10 minutes later or so, and yes, it could be 10 minutes. This is not lightning fast, but it's a lot faster than you could do it yourself. You have that first draft briefing. You've saved hours on creating it, but that's your first draft. And we're going to come back to something called one-shot, two-shot, or multi-shot approaches with using AI. But it's a great starting point, built from a great prompt. 3 touches that change everything here. So number 1, there's a bit of an advanced nod here. So if you're already using AI tools heavily with custom instructions, saved projects, connectors wired into SharePoint or Google Drive, you're probably a little bit further ahead. And I've just introduced some terms there that I'm actually not going to go into explaining today. We're going to cover that more advanced stuff in a later webinar. However, the shape that I've described, that pattern, still holds. It's still good practice. Ultimately, you're working to type less, but you're still saying the same 5 things. And that's partly because you've already provided it some of the context you'd be using. There's a really interesting thing which sometimes gets a bit of suspicion, which is touch 2, and that's the meta move. And it introduces something called meta prompting. And that sounds fancy, but really all that is if you don't know how to structure a prompt, or maybe you're dealing with something more complex, ask the AI to write the prompt for you. Explain what you're doing, explain that what you want to do, back to that context before in the task is that you are whoever you are, and what you need to do is help you write a task. It will literally interview you and ask you for information that helps build out and flesh out a really good prompt. The benefit of doing this as well is that each individual tool has slightly different biases towards certain approaches. The general shape stays the same, but use the tool you're going to use to ultimately query later, get it to build the prompt for you. That's meta prompting. There's some really good evidence behind this, actually, in some Google DeepMind research that was done that shows that prompts built this way often outperform any human written prompt. And it depends on the circumstance, but that can be 50 to 80% better performance. It's not right for every circumstance. It's overkill if you're asking it to do a simple task. But if you want something more complex, or it's pretty high stakes, use it. The final thing is calibration. So back to the kind of whether you use the meta move or whether you're using some of those more advanced tools, match the right prompt to the right task. Think about it in this term. You need to be improving in your ability and your understanding on how to prompt and how to use AI. If it just uses itself, then you're not really learning anything, and actually you're not going to be able or open or receptive to new developments in the space. So think about it in terms of mental arithmetic versus, let's say, quadratic equations. Match the effort to difficulty. You should be reasonably good at mental arithmetic, but no one expects you to be able to do quadratic equations in your head. So when you're dealing with that more complex piece, use things like meta prompting. If you're dealing with some mental arithmetic type tasks, write the prompt yourself. The number one thing that is critically important in anything you do here is context. It is king. So that can be different depending on the type of tool you're using. The most obvious one here is a chat type interface in the first regime here. This could be a blank window. Well, it has no context. So you bring that context back to the example before, attaching files, writing some prompts in and giving it that understanding. The tool pretty much is going to start with a blank page every time. There are some more advanced techniques that can build out context and build out understanding, but ultimately you are still that context pipeline. You've still got to provide it that context for it to understand. The strength here, though, is it's really flexible and it can kind of work with anything. By virtue of you being that context pipeline, it can pretty much work anywhere. The skills and projects that can exist in these tools help you add that context and persist that context, but nonetheless, it's very flexible. The weakness here, though, of course, is that you have to do that loading, and it's easy to miss what that tool can't see. You might make some assumptions that it knows something that it doesn't, and assumptions is where ultimately what you're trying to do in providing context and instructions is close assumption loops so that it gets better scoping and better refinement. Sort of at the other end of the spectrum is regime 2, which is in-product solutions. So an example of this would be Aptem Enhance or Copilot working directly in Word, or a tool like Grammarly. The tool already is isolated to the context. It might see the learner, the document you're already working on, or some evidence that exists. You don't need to write such a long prompt here if you're using it, because it already has a lot of that information. And as a result here, the strength here is permissions and audit information as well as context. It's already preloaded and baked in. It's a much safer environment as a result. And it's a really defensible starting point for applying AI in regulated work. But it naturally has its weaknesses. And yes, in this same section where I've mentioned Aptem Enhance, I am going to say that there are weaknesses in in-product AI capabilities, but they're really important to understand. You're bounded by the product. So that's both a major strength, but it is also a natural weakness, because if the task ultimately, or the data or context, lives outside of the system, you're going to need to step outside as well. But it makes it probably the safest space to use AI in a regulated context. Regime 3 is something called agents. So this is ultimately where AI is kind of going to go off and browse for or gather its own context. You're going to give it some instructions on how it would do that, but it's going to go off and read connectors, and those are things that go off to other systems. Let's say you've linked a solution off to your Office 365 or your SharePoint. Well, it can get context in there. It's going to go and query those systems and pull the data that it needs. You describe the goal it's kind of working towards, and ultimately it's going to assemble the rest. But this is ultimately a more advanced topic that we'll need to cover in a more deep dive session in the future. What this does is it scales beyond what a human could ultimately paste, and it handles a great deal of breadth very quickly and very capably. But the big weakness is you've got to trust it in doing its gathering. So there's a real check step here in regulated environments of making sure that you're verifying its approach. You're kind of validating how it does something before it even does it. Testing these things in something called a sandbox, which is effectively a safe space where you can test what agent you may or may not be using that is not leaking extra data or going places it shouldn't. You still need to keep humans accountable. There will not be an argument of saying, oh, the agent did that, that's not my fault. I'm not saying that to scare you. There are really good practices, which we will dig into in a future webinar. The other thing here, when people say AI, they mean probably one of four things. And you've probably heard it in a lot of conversations recently of like, I used AI to ... So pattern 1 here is a chat tool. We just talked about some of those in the previous regime look, and that's probably a tab in your browser. It could be a desktop application as well, but that's probably ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini, or something similar. And it's where most people first meet AI. It is ultimately generalist and standalone. And I want to touch on the generalist point a little bit. These tools are becoming more generalist and more powerful with it. So some of the strict scoping instructions you used to have to use are no longer necessary, but you still need to sort of follow that same pattern that I described before in creating that prompt and giving it the context, because you bring that context. They might be talking about a feature in a product, AI that's baked into something you already use. The drafting selection in Outlook, Grammarly in a document suggesting you change or rewrite something. AI inside a delivery platform like Aptem that already knows the learner and the standard they're operating on. The product does the heavy lifting, you just kind of see the output. It's narrow and purpose-built, and that's where its strength lies. Pattern 3 is the frankly older classifier type models. This is pattern matching and not generation. This has been around for quite a long time. You've probably seen this or felt this. I hope you haven't in some ways, but most people seem to have done, is AI that's quietly running in the background in fraud detection. You get that phone call or text message from your bank saying, there's a suspicious transaction. That's an example of a classifier type AI that you will have come across. You may not even have realized it was AI. Spam filters are another example of this, and triage systems that exist in support solutions. They've been around for a decade or more. It's not new, and it's not really what the headlines are about now, but it's still everywhere, and it's still really trusted because it's very predictable. I covered quite a lot about that in the first webinar. Pattern 4 is something that's kind of growing in its popularity, and you're certainly seeing a lot more come out around it. But it's AI that sits across your whole device. OS here meaning operating system. That's Microsoft 365 Copilot, for example, or Apple Intelligence if you use a Mac, or even on your phone. A lot of Apple phones now have that capability. It's not in one app, it's sort of in all of them. That is something that's worth, really stopping and considering whether that's something that you want to enable in your organization. It's something that you really need to think about in terms of risk. What's the AI actually doing, and what decision is it driving, is the ultimate question that comes up. There are three phrases that are worth deflating quickly when you hear them. AI powered. What does that mean? That means it's trained on your data, probably. The other thing that comes up is AGI. I don't know if anyone's seen this, but this has been coming up more and more recently. We are not there yet. That is sort of artificial general intelligence, where that's really it being able to think entirely on its own. We are way, way, way off that at the minute. Some people will say we're closer than others. Always ask specifically what's happening underneath. If anyone says AI powered, trained on your data, AGI, be curious. Say, what do you mean by that? Get them to explain it, because you'll find that pretty much all of them will fit somewhere into these patterns I've just talked about, and therefore they need treating slightly differently. So the last thing in this section is kind of a map of the whole field. What does it look like? Number one, you've got predictive and classification type solutions. These are older machine learning based solutions, or they can be newly created machine learning, but older in terms of the concept of machine learning. They're pattern matching against labels, as I gave in the previous example, that sort of bank fraud detection, credit scoring, email triage. It's accurate, it's kind of boring, and that's its purpose, and it's invisible. It's meant to be. It's not what anyone means when they say AI today, really. It certainly was 3 to 4 years ago, but it's there. And in a lot of cases, it's the right tool because it's auditable and it's narrow. Item 2 here is generative. We started talking about this at the very beginning. What's changed everything in the last 3 years, to be honest? It produces new content on request, words, images, code, even video. And it ultimately comes in two flavors at the minute, with assistive, and that's somebody helping it get along. That person is still driving it, or agentic, which takes the action itself. It's still working on your instructions, but one needs you, the other one can allow to work in the background based on your signals. And that's most of what's happening today. The final one I will reference, because it's sort of on the fringes, is perception. These are things like vision, speech, signal processing. You've seen probably a number of these things coming about with Meta glasses, for example, which is capable of listening to someone speaking in a foreign language and auto-translating it for you. It's not the only thing that can do that, but that's an example of perception-based AI. It's also the thing that can start with transcribing meetings and reading documents on the fly. It's a bit different to here's the transcript of a meeting that's just taken place. Now go and transcribe it. It would do it automatically. There's a slight form of it here in GoToWebinar that could be enabled. I could turn on live captions. That is an example of a lightweight perception AI. Rule of thumb before we leave this slide, pick the most specific, most passive tool that solves your problem. Grammarly is specific and passive. It knows you're editing a document, but waits for you to accept or reject. An agent browsing the web on your behalf is general and active. Both are AI, but both have very different risk profiles. Both are very possible today. Now, let's look at 3 names of tools that you already know. ChatGPT, Claude, and Microsoft Copilot. The same prompt shape that we described at the start can be used in any one of them, but each tool has a slightly different feel, and you should always pick based on what you're doing and not what's loudest. In the next webinar in this series, I'm actually going to talk a lot more about choosing the right tool for the right task, and we'll dig into this in a lot more depth, but I want to give you a general overview and understanding. I'm not a salesperson for any of these, but I will talk to you about some of the nuances and differences. ChatGPT, mainly a chat tool. You're going to bring that context. Claude, it sits kind of in between what ChatGPT does and what Copilot can do, and take some things one step beyond. The product ultimately here allows you to reach more easily towards those agents and understanding of richer context. Copilot is mainly an embedded product. The product itself is bringing that context, and the product in this case is Microsoft 365 and everything in that landscape. We're going to dig into each of these in a little bit more detail. So I'll head further forwards now and just talk about ChatGPT as the confident and friendly generalist. And friendliness is important here. If you've worked with ChatGPT for long enough, you'll know it is very, very friendly and often a little too sycophantic. It is the ultimate Labrador puppy trying to seek your affection. It's tried everything at least once. It'll have a go at pretty much anything you throw at it. It's fast, and it's happy to produce multiple versions of the same thing if you ask it to. It's got strong native image generation, and it's got a voice mode that's really comfortable if you want to have to and fro long conversations. It's really good for breadth and variety and first drafts of most things. A proposal or a job advert, maybe even a training plan, but that might be pushing it a bit too far. Certainly marketing emails. Also, you could use it for kind of the awkward message that you don't really know how to write yourself, the response to a slightly difficult email that you may have received. It's quite good at tweaking what we've provided it and turning that into something kind of back to the start as friendly, professional. It's its jam, really. It connects a huge range of tools it's been around for longer, so there are more tools that are sort of natively able to integrate with it, whether that's SharePoint, Slack, GitHub, Atlassian. It lives across a lot of systems, and it can reach into them to get further context. So a worked example here would be you need a first-pass marketing plan for a new apprenticeship program. You give ChatGPT a short brief, and a minute or so later, you've got a structure, you've got some talking points, you've got some channel suggestions. It's a good starting point, but it's kind of vague and high level. It really needs a human to refine and fact check before it's going to go anywhere. And that's kind of true of a lot of these tools, but ChatGPT more than any other, because of its generalist nature, you're going to need to work with it a lot more in what its first output is. Ultimately, where it kind of wobbles a bit is it's a bit confident. It confidently invents things, and this sort of touches into hallucination. It is probably the tool in this list, and I'm sure they might thank me for saying this, that is most predisposed to hallucinate. Back to that overexcited Labrador puppy. It just wants to please you, even if the thing it does isn't quite what you want. It will probably go off and cite a statistic that doesn't exist, but it will do it really confidently. It will give you a quote that goes alongside it that gives you confidence in yourself. That it's like, oh, it must be right. So you must absolutely check, particularly with ChatGPT, that its references are correct and that it has actually got the thing correctly. Data handling is a bit of a concern on some of the consumer plans, and this isn't unique to ChatGPT, but particularly with ChatGPT, where OpenAI will absolutely use, by default, anything that you give it to train its models. So really, really important to make sure that if you are going to use this as a tool, you buy an enterprise or a team version of it so that you can control that. There's quite a lot of churn in this product, and I don't mean in terms of users, but I mean in terms of sort of features that are taking place, and that's unique not to ChatGPT, but it's something that's special about AI and the LLM world we're in. What you learned last month or even last week might have moved or changed or been renamed, so it's something you're going to need to stay up to date with. And there's therefore a small kind of ongoing cost to you, but that cost is almost certainly less than what you would have spent doing the work that it is now able to help you with. So when to reach this ultimately is if you're doing some drafting or some brainstorming where you really want that breadth and you don't need the depth, where you always know that there's a human that's going to read the output before it goes anywhere, and making sure that it's probably supplementary information rather than primary information. Microsoft 365 will come next, but I want to talk about Claude before I do. Claude is well, I'm a bit of a Claude fanboy. I used to be a ChatGPT fanboy, so there might be some bias in this piece, but it's a careful and thorough colleague who reads a whole document before they reply. It's absolutely not the fastest out there, but it is by far and away, when you need something done properly, it really does try to do it properly. It will push back on you. It's not quite so sycophantic or overly friendly as ChatGPT, and it will really show you it's working. You'll know how it got there, and it's really happy to disagree with you, which is hugely valuable because it does feel more like that colleague working alongside you rather than the sort of assistant working in the background. It's absolutely excellent for long documents and long reasoning. It can hold up to 1 million tokens in context. What's a token? In plain English, that's roughly 750,000 words, or a 120-page report. It can do the whole of it at once. Not a summary of it, not the first 10 pages, the entire thing. And that is the real step change with Claude and their more advanced models, is that sheer amount of context that it can hold. So long form writing where the prose has to be good, board papers, reports, evidence packs, structured and repeatable work, that's kind of where it shines. It has a bunch of extra advanced features as well that we won't cover today, but they're projects and skills and something called co-work. You'll be receiving at the end of today's session a bit of a terminology sheet that will cover some of those things as well, so you can refer back to it. The idea here, though, is that once you've set something up and you've worked with Claude, you can kind of run it again and again without continuously rewriting the prompt. It's a great thing to give you a second opinion. Let's say you use two tools, you use both ChatGPT and Claude, and I'm not advocating for that, but it could be a good second opinion on the output that's come from another AI tool to really interrogate it and understand it. Where does it wobble? It's a smaller ecosystem currently than ChatGPT. There are fewer off-the-shelf connectors, but they are growing in number massively, and they are really investing in this space. It doesn't do native image generation. It can kind of create some graphics for you, but if what you want is an AI tool that's going to create images, that's not Claude. If you need pictures, use something else. There are growing trends and growing development, and probably Claude is moving quicker than others at the moment. I'm not talking about Gemini today, but part of the reason I'm not is they are yet to release their newest, most exciting capability. So I'm sure we can talk about that at some point in the future. Ultimately, you reach for Claude when the quality of your output really matters. If the document you're building or the report you're building is really long, or what you need to ingest is really long as context, and you want it to work through something in sort of very systematic approach and not necessarily have to chat continuously with it to get the output you're looking for. It can take a really complex task and chunk that down for you. Finally, Microsoft 365 Copilot. I just want to talk a little bit here about names briefly. There's the word Copilot seems to be appearing all over the place. You've got Microsoft 365 Copilot, you've got Consumer Copilot, which is also a Microsoft product. You've got Copilot Pro, which is also a consumer product. And then you've got GitHub Copilot, which has nothing to do with that at all, and Copilot Studio, which is another Microsoft product. There are all sorts of other examples of Copilot being used, but most people, at least in this industry, when they say Copilot, they probably mean Microsoft 365 Copilot. But it could be worth checking if you do talk to anyone and they raise it. So what this kind of feels like is it's AI where your work already is if you're in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. It's in Word as you're writing, it's in Outlook as you're triaging your inbox, it's in Teams as a meeting is running. Or it's helping you with Excel on a spreadsheet that you'd rather not read or you want some help analyzing. Any of the previous tools, ChatGPT and Claude, is very capable of connecting with this, but it's not native in the same way. So you're always going to be working kind of with Claude to work with it. And whilst they're building out their connector landscape, that is changing and certainly infringing on the Microsoft ecosystem. But what this is really good for is making sure that there's really limited context switching. The AI lives in the tools that you already use, so you don't need them to learn a new place to go. it's grounded in your tenant, and it respects any existing permissions that you have in that Microsoft ecosystem. So it doesn't see anything the person shouldn't already be able to see. And it's ultimately multimodal under the hood. So from 2026, it routes across ChatGPT and Claude inside the same product, depending on the task. One subscription is more than one engine, effectively. However, it kind of wobbles because quality really does vary between the apps. It's really strong in Word, Outlook, and Teams, yet ironically, it's pretty patchy in things like PowerPoint and can be challenging to use in Excel, where the reason it's ironic is actually that's where Claude is really coming out to shine, is its ability to handle PowerPoint and Excel better than even Microsoft Copilot does. That's not exclusively true everywhere, but it is starting to be a trend. The other thing I'd say is that costs really stack up here. If it sits on top of your existing Microsoft 365 licenses, the bill can get big really quickly, but there is obviously the argument that the efficiency gains that you get from that massively outweigh that. There is one really key thing that I'll call out here. A lot of people's Microsoft 365 or SharePoint ecosystems were not set up with the idea in mind that this sort of omniscient solution that would come in and be able to access a lot of this functionality. And some of this can be accidental, but a lot of it is because it wasn't necessary to have the strict permissions controls that it sort of relies on when you can go and ask it a question. Take a really extreme example of a payroll file that was shared with, let's say, me 2 years ago when I was in a HR function. I'm no longer in that HR function, but that share still exists with me. And so I should not now be able to see it. And yet, if I ask Copilot, I can see it. So there's a real audit that needs to take place. This is not the fault of the AI. This is ultimately the failing, in the nicest way possible, of permissions control and permissions creep that's taken place over a long period of time. And as a result, organizations, and we're an example of it here at Aptem, where we're actually preferring to work with the likes of Claude and connecting it to things because it respects permissions better. We don't need to go rebuild everything to make sure that it perfectly fits this new model. So moving on, I want to take the common concepts across all of them. We're going into detail on this in later sessions, but I've mentioned agents and custom assistants. So very briefly, you might see these in those tools. ChatGPT calls agents agent mode. Claude calls it co-work, or might refer to it as computer use or Claude Code. Microsoft calls it agent mode in most of its apps, and also in Copilot Studio if you're building your own. The second one is custom assistants. These are things that have been built, a reusable AI that's set up to do the job more than once, kind of got its own instructions. You'll see that in ChatGPT under the banner of something called custom GPTs. Claude kind of calls these projects that are combined with skills. And Microsoft, really rather confusingly, also calls these agents. So you've got agents and agents actually trying to be the same thing, which can get a bit confusing. But as I said, we'll cover into anything around agents and custom assistants in a future session. 3 labels ultimately, but there's one idea. The idea is scheduling tasks, creating artifacts, doing deep research. It's a sort of multimodal approach moving forwards, and therefore build on some of the building blocks and basics, and then next time we're going to cover in a little bit more into the detail. The final sort of informational slide I'm going to talk about here is a bit about risk, and mostly webinar 1 covered into this in terms of the responsible use of AI. But this is a sort of plain English reminder of what that looks like. So data leakage is a term. What you paste may train the model. So you just need to be very careful about how you've got whatever tool set up, and make sure if you go and check into the privacy settings that you're not training the model. In all of them, you can typically turn it off. In some of the consumer level offerings for these, you can't. So you need to be careful about making sure that you are onto a paid plan. You could argue that that's a bit of a trap, but you're paying for value, you're paying for some assurance there. Your rule, if you're ever considering putting learner feedback or learner data or anything in, is to make sure retention is turned off. and there's a clear data handling statement. There are occasions where you can choose to turn retention on, but still not train the model. That would be your choice as part of your responsible AI approach. Risk 2 is overtrust and unchecked outputs. AI is really good at inventing plausible truth or plausible untruth. They look kind of the same. One is very useful, one is not. It can be the case that a provider might cite a fabricated Ofsted case study, which looks fantastic. It looks like it's right, but you dig into the details and it's not. So the AI drafts it, but you take responsibility and accountability. Risk 3 is, I've just mentioned this in relation to Copilot, is permission creep. Ultimately, be careful with what you're sharing and make sure that you have a good audit practice on who has access to what, and using group structures is often a very good way of doing this rather than discrete permissions handling or discrete sharing of things within a different ecosystem, particularly when you're thinking about Microsoft 365 or even Google Drive. Fix the permissions, not the AI. The AI isn't actually at fault here. The final piece is risk 4, agentic action. If you are starting to look into this space, make sure that you don't allow it to make irreversible actions that you didn't mean. And what does that mean? It means make sure as you build these things that it's able to read things, access them, and double check with you before it writes anything, double check with you before it changes anything. It adds an approval step, sure, but you didn't have to create the content. So you're doing effectively risk 2 and risk 4 together. You're checking that over trust, you're checking whether something is accurate, and also you're making sure that it's doing the right thing. Only much later on, when you're really confident with how it's approaching, should you ever consider allowing an agent to take full action for you, and it's to be used sparingly, at least at the minute. Okay, so what do you need to do? Some use cases and a bit of homework. I've suggested that 5 places you can begin on Monday. You can choose to do it tomorrow, but I thought we'll start a fresh week and you can practice some of the things that we've talked about today. I will be sharing a sort of a handout after today's session that can help you take this through, and that's a sort of prompt shape worksheet alongside some terminology. So pick any one of these, or pick one that you actually created after webinar 1 as part of your responsible AI worksheet, which is pick the frictionful task. That might be something small or new or pressing. That's the Skills England standard that's changed relating to some particular standard you operate, some feedback that you want it to adopt, some sort of translation of a policy into something that is easier to understand or easier to communicate. Start with something you feel the friction from today, because then you'll really feel the change in its output. Start narrow and start specific and start supervised. So don't just let it run off. Back to my agentic point before, don't try and run before you can walk. Pick one task, one tool, one reviewer, and use that prompt shape handout that I'll be giving you, which goes through today's session of how to build that prompt. Experiment with it, see what works for you in your context, but remember that providing it a hierarchical shape really helps. Bring it to the next webinar on May 28th. So aligned with that, I really do recommend, if you didn't watch it already, you go off and rewatch the responsible AI session that we had about 3 weeks to a month ago. The recording was available. I'm sure we can provide that in the follow-up email so you can rewatch it today. Download the kit that we'll provide to you. That's the plain English AI starter kit, and that's side 1 is today in 1 page, the terminology and a few extra bonus terms. And side 2 is the prompt shape worksheet. That will be sent over to you as part of that follow-up. The next webinar, make sure you register for it. There'll be a QR code coming on the next slide to allow you to register whilst on the call today. We're going to look at the risk and opportunity of different AI products. The landing line here ultimately is AI is not the strategy. The strategy is still quality, cost and risk, the people you serve. AI is the capability inside that. Start small, start supervised, and hopefully start this week if you haven't already. One more thing before Q&A. One thing I haven't talked about today is the specifics behind some of those tools. And so, as I mentioned throughout today's session, we're going to talk about some specific products and the models behind them, like when you'd pick Opus, which is a model within Claude versus something else. We're going to talk about that in the next session, session 3 of this. The QR code on screen right now will take you to the registration page for that webinar. It is on Thursday, May 28th at 11 a.m. and will be approximately 45 minutes to 1 hour. I sincerely hope I'll see you all again there. And thank you ever so much for giving me your time today. Ultimately, now I'm going to take us over for some Q&A. I'll take a look and see whether we've got some questions in the chat. It looks like we have around 8 at the minute, so let me just have a quick look at those. How can we access the recording? I think that's been answered for you. Is Claude free for general use? If it is, what might the limitations be in terms of use? You're going to need to make this decision as an organization yourself. I can't tell you what to do, but yes, there is a free version of Claude available. I strongly recommend that if you're using it for work, you do not use the free version. That's the same of any of these tools, and it's because you need to be able to control what data is used in training, if at all, what data is retained, if at all. So really important that you double check and follow good practices. Hopefully your organization has some good practices on data protection, and something that we could consider covering in a future session if of interest, something called an AI impact assessment. That's going to look at the kinds of data it can access, where the data is stored, very much like something you might be familiar with called a DPIA, which is for GDPR. This is looking at that through the lens of AI. So I don't recommend you use it free unless it's for personal use, in which case the risk is yours and you're choosing to take that risk, but not for your organization. Another question here is, in selecting an AI tool to use, do you personally also consider non-technical factors, such as Anthropic's recent strong ethical stance? If you're asking me personally, absolutely. There's no requirement for you to do so. There's no requirement for you to take that ethical approach. But I would obviously thoroughly recommend you do, and we certainly do as an organization. Thank you for that question. Probably got time for 1 or 2 more, so let's have a look. Just factoring through them. We've got a few more about recording. Looks like I've got 1 more here. Let me read that quickly just so I understand it. Okay, if we've only got budget for 1 tool, which tool should we go for? We're a small training provider, we can't buy all 3. Okay, first of all, I wasn't saying you have to buy all 3. To be very clear, I was giving you an overall understanding of 3 common tools in the market. We'll talk a bit more in the next webinar about how you pick the right tool, but just pick one. If you're asking me for my opinion, it's a bit cheeky for me to say this, I suppose, because I'm not exactly representing them as an organization, but I have absolutely fallen in love with Claude. I'm sure you will if you try and use it too. 1 point to note is it's a bit more expensive than the other ones. So if cost is really a factor, you're better off using some form of it than none. But back to my previous point, please avoid the consumer level products that don't allow you to control data. I think that's it, and we're out of time. If there were any questions that I didn't get to, I'm very sorry, but hopefully you've enjoyed today's session. And thank you ever so much for coming. Again, please register. And it's been great having you here. Please take care.